The city of Enugu had never seen such a celebration. Udachukwu and Neoma's wedding was a spectacle that made headlines in local newspapers and left neighbors gossiping for weeks. The reception hall glittered with chandeliers, guests arrived in fleets of cars, and the couple themselves danced in resplendent attire that spoke of wealth and promise. Udachukwu, dressed in a perfectly tailored white suit, held his bride's hand with pride, declaring in every movement that she was his treasure. Neoma, radiant in lace and pearls, moved with a kind of grace that silenced the room whenever she turned her face. Elders showered them with blessings, praying that their union would be fruitful, that their home would echo with the cries of children, and that their love would never know cracks. They laughed then, so sure of the future, never suspecting that the very thing they desired most would become the battlefield of their marriage. The early years felt like a fairy tale. Udachukwu built his business with Neoma by his side, and together they were envied by their peers. Friends marveled at how she stood by him during late nights and early mornings, how she cooked for workers who came to their home, how her laughter seemed to make even difficult days bearable. People said she was his lucky charm, the reason contracts came his way, the reason doors opened. Yet as year after year passed without the arrival of a child, admiration slowly turned to whispers. In their culture, the absence of children was never viewed as a simple challenge. It was a stain, a shadow, something that gnawed at family pride. What once drew admiration now drew pity, and pity slowly morphed into quiet mockery. Neoma felt the shift before anyone voiced it aloud. She noticed the way women lingered their eyes on her stomach during gatherings, the way questions like "how far now?" turned into silence heavy with judgment. She noticed how Mama Udo, her mother-in-law, no longer embraced her warmly, but instead muttered prayers for grandchildren whenever they met. Still, she smiled, determined to keep faith. She reassured herself that love could survive this, that she and her husband could weather the storm. She clung to the memory of his vows, the promise he whispered on their wedding night. "You and I, forever, no matter what." What she didn't know was how quickly forever could start unraveling when pride met pressure. By the 4th year of their marriage, silence had become a constant companion in their home. At night, Neoma lay awake listening to Udachukwu's steady breathing, wondering what thoughts consumed him as he turned away from her on the bed. She spent her days in hospital waiting rooms, undergoing tests, drinking bitter herbs recommended by her aunties, fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Every result she carried back home told the same story. She was healthy. But the lack of a child was like an unanswered question scratching at her soul. When she tried to share the results with Udachukwu, his response was often a dismissive wave or silence that stung more than words. He began to bury himself in work, returning late, claiming exhaustion, leaving her to cry in the darkness where no one could see. The community, however, saw everything. At family functions, cousins whispered, 7 years and nothing to show. Her sisters-in-law were crueler, reminding her that her bride price was not paid so she could be an empty vessel in their compound. Mama Udo herself, who had once called her daughter, now treated her as an obstacle, telling friends in the market, "What good is a wife who cannot bring forth life?" The ridicule was cutting, but what cut deeper was her husband's silence in the face of these insults. He never defended her. Instead, his silence became agreement, his downcast eyes became consent, and slowly she realized she was fighting alone in a marriage built for two. Still, Neoma fought with quiet resilience. She poured herself into charity, into church service, into anything that could fill the emptiness growing within her. Children from the neighborhood ran to her compound to eat her cooking, and she held them with the tenderness of a mother. To outsiders, she appeared strong, but inside she was breaking. She prayed every night, tears soaking her pillow, whispering, "Lord, just one child, even if it takes my last breath." She carried the shame of barrenness like a scar tattooed on her skin, believing that somehow, someday, the tide would turn. But the tide was not in her favor, at least not yet. The turning point came the day Mama Udo visited with Udachukwu's elder sister, Chinyu. They sat in the parlor like judges before a defendant. their voices dripping with scorn as they addressed him, while Neoma served them tea. "My son," Mama Udo said, "a man is known by his seed. You are my pride. How can you sit quietly while this woman keeps you childless? Time is going, and legacy waits for no one." Chinny nodded in agreement, her words sharper than a knife. "Brother, do you know how many women would give you sons by now? Why waste your life on someone who has tied your destiny?" Their words dripped like venom, poisoning his mind, feeding the pride that was already restless. Neoma stood there, tray trembling in her hands, fighting the tears that burned her eyes. She wanted to scream that it wasn't her fault, to show them the medical results, to beg for her husband's voice in her defense. But Yudachukwu sat in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet hers. That silence cut her deeper than any insult. In that silence, he had chosen a side, and it was not hers. She excused herself, retreating to their bedroom where she fell to her knees, praying through tears that God would not let her home crumble. Yet even in prayer, her heart knew a wedge had been driven into their marriage, and the man who once vowed to protect her had become a stranger. From that day on, the atmosphere in their home shifted. Yudachukwu became distant, cold. He stopped eating her food, claiming he had eaten at work. He started sleeping out more, returning at odd hours, carrying the faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. When she asked questions, he snapped at her, telling her to focus on fasting for a child instead of policing him. The poison his family had poured into his ears had taken root, and every word he spoke now carried blame. He didn't need proof. He had already decided she was barren. And with that decision, their once vibrant home became a place of shadows and unspoken grief. The first time Yudachukwu called her barren in public, it was at his friend's birthday party. Surrounded by laughter, food, and music, someone had joked lightly about when it would be their turn to bring children to the gathering. Without hesitation, Yudachukwu laughed loudly and said, "Ask my wife O. She has locked her womb since. Me, I'm just waiting." The crowd erupted in uneasy chuckles, some covering their discomfort with forced laughter, others exchanging glances of pity toward Neoma. She froze, her face burning, tears stinging her eyes, but she forced a smile. In that moment, she realized the man who once shielded her had now become the one wielding the knife. After that night, the accusations became constant. He repeated them at family dinners, in front of neighbors, even in arguments at home. "You are useless to me. What kind of wife cannot give me a child?" His words were daggers, and each one left scars invisible to the eye, but heavy on her spirit. Neoma began to avoid social gatherings, ashamed of the stares and whispers. She lived like a shadow in her own marriage, a woman who cooked, cleaned, and smiled on command, but inside she was dying. She carried the weight of humiliation silently, clinging only to her faith as her last anchor. The cruelest cut came when he told her one night, in a voice cold as ice, "If you cannot give me children, what use are you to me?" She stared at him, heart-shattering, realizing that the man who once swore she was his world now saw her as nothing more than a failure. That night she didn't cry. Her tears had run dry. Instead, she sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, wondering how love could transform so completely into contempt. It was then she vowed in her heart that one day, truth would speak for her, even if she never opened her mouth again. The affair began like a whisper in the wind, subtle, easy to dismiss, but it grew into a storm that would shake the very foundation of Yudachukwu and Neoma's marriage. One evening, after a tense quarrel about children, Yudachukwu stormed out of the house and ended up at a lounge where he met Ifeanyi, a striking young woman with bold red lipstick, sharp eyes that studied him, and laughter that flattered his ego. Unlike Neoma, who spoke of hospitals and prayer, Ifeanyi spoke of enjoying life, of giving him what he deserved. Her words were honey-coated poison, seeping into the cracks of his wounded pride. He convinced himself that she was different, that perhaps through her he could reclaim the manhood his wife's supposed barrenness had stolen from him. Nights that should have been spent beside his wife were now wasted in the arms of a stranger who fed his arrogance. Neoma sensed the change immediately. She noticed the scent of expensive perfume clinging to his shirts, the faint traces of lipstick on his collar, the sudden habit of bathing at midnight when he returned home. When she asked him where he had been, he met her gaze with disdain. "Maybe if you gave me children, I wouldn't need to find joy elsewhere," he sneered, leaving her crushed and trembling. The betrayal wasn't just in his words or his absence. It was in the deliberate way he used her pain as justification for his disloyalty. She began to live in fear of his footsteps, never knowing whether he would come home angry, indifferent, or not at all. The warmth of their once loving marriage had turned into a cold battlefield, with Ifeanyi's shadow growing larger in every corner of their home. Yet in the midst of her sorrow, Neoma still prayed for him. She fasted for his heart to soften, lit candles at midnight vigils, begged God for the strength to endure. She could not bring herself to hate him, even as he tore her apart piece by piece. To her, marriage was sacred, and leaving was not an option, at least not yet. Her only hope was that someday, somehow, Yudachukwu would remember the man he once was. But with each passing day, the man she had married was slipping further away, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. It was on a rainy afternoon that Neoma finally found the courage to confront him. She had just returned from the hospital, clutching yet another test result that confirmed her womb was perfectly fine. With trembling hands and a heart racing with fear, she placed the papers on the dining table before him. "Udo," she whispered, her voice breaking, "the doctors say I am not the problem. Please, for the sake of our marriage, go with me. Let us both get tested." Her words were not accusations. They were pleas, desperate attempts to save what little was left between them. But Yudachukwu's reaction was explosive. He slammed his fist against the table, sending the papers flying to the floor. His eyes burned with rage as he stood over her. "How dare you? You think I am the problem? Me? A man like me?" His voice rose to a roar, drawing the attention of neighbors. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her as if the truth she carried in her hands was an insult too heavy to bear. "Do you know how many women out there would gladly give me sons? Do you know how many men envy me? And you stand here calling me weak." His pride, bruised and cornered, lashed out with cruelty, and in that moment Neoma realized she had reached the limits of his humility. His ego would rather destroy their marriage than face the possibility of fault. Shattered, she sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face, begging him not to let pride ruin them. But he turned away, storming out into the rain, leaving her kneeling on the cold floor with the papers scattered around her like pieces of a broken dream. That night, she lay awake in the silence, realizing that love alone could not hold a marriage where truth was denied. The plea she had made with love and humility had been twisted into an insult he could not forgive. For the first time, she began to wonder if the God she prayed to was silent, or if he was simply waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth she already suspected. 2 months later, Ifeanyi appeared at Yudachukwu's office with a smile that could cut glass and a hand resting dramatically on her belly. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her eyes shining with triumph. Yudachukwu nearly wept with relief. He called his friends that evening, boasting that he had finally been vindicated, that the problem was not him, but the barren woman at home. News spread like wildfire. Mama Udo danced in her compound, praising God for her son's proven manhood, while neighbors nodded knowingly, saying, "So it was Neoma after all." For once, Yudachukwu walked with his head high, puffed with pride, oblivious to the fact that the victory he celebrated was a mirage. When Neoma heard the news, it broke her heart into pieces too sharp to gather. She sat in her bedroom, clutching her rosary, whispering prayers that turned into sobs. She had fought to keep her dignity intact, but now the world around her was convinced of her barrenness. Women she once called friends stopped visiting, whispering behind her back she wasted his years. Children in the neighborhood pointed at her as she passed, repeating words they had heard home. And her husband, the man who once called her his crown, paraded his mistress's supposed pregnancy like a trophy, never once pausing to consider the devastation he left in his wife's heart. The humiliation reached its peak at a family gathering, where Yudachukwu proudly introduced Ifeanyi, declaring that she was carrying the child that would finally continue his lineage. Neoma sat in silence, her hands trembling, as laughter and mocking glances burned her skin. She wanted to scream, to hold up the test results that proved she was not at fault, but her dignity would not let her beg before those who had already condemned her. That night, as she lay alone in her room, she whispered to God one last prayer. If truth lives, let it speak for me, even if I never open my mouth again. The days that followed were worse than any nightmare. Ifeanyi, emboldened by her new position, began visiting Udachukwa's house openly. She strutted through the compound with arrogance, touching her belly as if to remind everyone of her supposed importance. Mama Udo welcomed her like a daughter, calling her Nwanyani, our wife, and treating Neoma like a stranger. Even neighbors who once greeted Neoma with respect now barely acknowledged her presence. The humiliation was public, deliberate, and suffocating. She became a ghost in her own home, a silent witness to her own dethronement. One evening, when Udachukwu returned home with Ifeanyi by his side, Neoma finally broke her silence. She stood in the parlor, her voice steady but her heart breaking, and said, "If you have decided she is your wife, then why keep me here as a prisoner?" Her words were met with scorn. Udachukwu sneered, "You should be grateful I kept you this long. What use is a wife who cannot conceive? At least she will give me a son." His words were venom, striking her with finality. In that moment, she realized he had not only abandoned her, but had stripped her of dignity, turning her into a living sacrifice to his pride. That night, Neoma did not cry. Her tears had been exhausted, her soul emptied of sorrow. Instead, she sat quietly by her window, gazing at the stars, whispering a single prayer. "Lord, let truth fight for me." She knew that she could not win against lies with arguments, nor against pride with pleas. All she had left was faith that the same God who gave her strength to endure would, in his time, expose the falsehoods that had chained her. The house was no longer her home, her husband no longer her companion, but within her chest a quiet strength began to form, a strength that would one day make her walk away with her head held high. At first, Ifeanyi played her role convincingly, dressing in loose clothes, walking with exaggerated caution, placing her hands over her belly as though protecting a precious life. But as months passed, the cracks in her story began to show. There was no swelling, no morning sickness, no doctor visits with actual reports, only words and stage smiles. Neighbors whispered quietly, "Is this pregnancy real? Why does she look the same?" But Udachukwu dismissed their suspicions. Pride had blinded him, and he saw only what he wanted to see, proof that his manhood was intact. He basked in false glory, repeating to anyone who would listen that his wife was the barren one while his mistress carried his child. The lie became his crutch, his defense, the foundation upon which his arrogance stood. Neoma, however, watched with silent eyes. She noticed the inconsistencies, the foods Ifeanyi claimed to crave one day and hate the next, the way she pretended to feel dizzy when convenient, the way she always dodged questions about prenatal checkups. Neoma said nothing, not because she didn't see, but because she knew truth needed no helper. Her silence unsettled Ifeanyi, who began to lash out more in subtle ways, mocking Neoma in her own home. Yet through it all, Neoma bore her humiliation with a composure that puzzled many. She had been broken, yes, but from the shards of that brokenness, a quiet strength had begun to emerge. The turning point came during a church service. A well-meaning elder laid his hand on Ifeanyi's stomach to pray for the unborn child. After a long pause, he pulled his hand back, his eyes flickering with confusion. His wife, sitting beside him, whispered a question he refused to answer. The congregation didn't miss the awkward silence. Whispers spread like fire across dry grass. Ifeanyi noticed the stares, the questioning glances, and for the first time, fear crept into her confidence. She realized her charade was slipping, but it was too late. The seeds of doubt had already been planted in the minds of many. It was on a sweltering afternoon that the lie finally began to crumble. Ifeananya collapsed dramatically at the market, clutching her stomach, screaming that she was losing the baby. Panic erupted. Traders abandoned their stalls, rushing to help. She was whisked to the hospital, her cries echoing through the hallways. Yudachukwu arrived moments later, frantic, sweat streaming down his face as he demanded the doctors save his child. He paced the waiting room like a madman, shouting at nurses, promising money if they saved what he believed was the heir to his name. But the truth cannot be buried forever. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was calm, almost pitying. He beckoned Yudachukwu into his office. "Mr. Yudachukwu," he began gently, "there was no pregnancy to lose. Your mistress was never carrying a child." The words hit him like a thunderclap, sending shock waves through his chest. "What do you mean no pregnancy?" he demanded, his voice trembling with disbelief. But the doctor was unshaken. Tests had been run, blood work, ultrasounds, everything confirmed the same truth. Ifeananya had deceived him and everyone else. Yudachukwu staggered back, his legs weakening, as the foundation of his pride cracked beneath him. Outside the office, whispers had already begun. Ifeanyanya's screams had been heard, but now the silence of truth filled the hospital corridors. Neoma, who had come after hearing of the incident, stood quietly in the waiting room, watching her husband's world collapse. Her heart did not leap with joy, it broke anew. For years, she had endured humiliation because of a lie. Now the lie was revealed, but instead of satisfaction, she felt only the emptiness of wasted years. She turned her face away as Yudachukwu stumbled past her, his eyes wide with confusion, his pride bleeding like an open wound. The hospital, bound by ethics, insisted on further testing to confirm the truth. Both Ifeananya and Yudachukwu were required to undergo examinations. Ifeanyanya's deceit was confirmed beyond doubt, but the true shock came when the doctors revealed the results of Yudachukwu's tests. "Sir," the physician said, his tone firm yet compassionate, "you have a condition that makes natural conception highly unlikely. You may not have known this, but medically, the chances of you fathering children are extremely slim." The words struck him like bolts of lightning, searing through the armor of pride he had hidden behind for years. His knees buckled, and he sat heavily in the chair, staring blankly at the wall. The problem had never been Neoma. It had always been him. The weight of the revelation spread quickly. Mama Udo, who had paraded Ifeananya as proof of her son's virility, fainted when she heard the news. His sisters, who had mocked Neoma so mercilessly, now avoided her eyes, their shame burning hotter than fire. Neighbors, once so quick to whisper against Neoma, now exchanged looks of pity for her and disdain for Yudachukwu. His arrogance had painted her as barren, but the truth had unveiled his hypocrisy, leaving him exposed, naked before the very people he had sought to impress. His world was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Neoma, meanwhile, stood in the eye of the storm with quiet dignity. She did not shout, did not mock, did not wave the test results in anyone's face. She simply stood still, her silence speaking louder than any words could. Those who once pitied her now admired her strength, whispering that she was a woman of rare grace. In her heart, she felt no victory, only sorrow for the years lost, for the love that had withered under the weight of false accusations. Truth had spoken at last, but its voice was heavy, carrying both freedom and heartbreak. The days that followed were a nightmare for Yudachukwu. Everywhere he went, whispers followed. Men who once envied him now mocked him in hushed tones. Women who had once praised him now shook their heads. Business partners looked at him differently, as though his fertility had anything to do with his contracts. The humiliation was unbearable. He stopped leaving his house, locking himself away in his room, drowning in alcohol and regret. The arrogance that had fueled his accusations had evaporated, leaving only a broken shell of a man who had built his pride on lies. At home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Ifeananya disappeared, unwilling to face the shame of her deception. Mama Udo became a shadow of herself, too ashamed to show her face in the market where she had once boasted. The house was filled with silence, heavy and accusing. For the first time, Chukwu realized the depth of the damage he had done to Neoma. He replayed every word he had spoken to her, every insult, every public humiliation, and the weight of his cruelty crushed him. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, but shame chained his tongue. What words could erase years of pain? Neoma, though broken, walked with a dignity that stunned those around her. She no longer cried in secret. She no longer begged him to change. She simply moved with quiet strength, her spirit lifted not by vindication, but by the knowledge that truth had finally been revealed. Her silence was his loudest judgment. Every time he looked at her, he saw the reflection of his own failure staring back at him. He wanted to reach out to plead, to cling to her, but he knew deep inside that their marriage had already died long before the truth was spoken. Now, all that remained was the hollow shell of what once had been. The truth gnawed at Chukwu like a relentless vulture pecking at an open wound. He could barely sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the face of Neoma, eyes swollen from years of crying, lips trembling as he called her BARREN before crowds. In his drunken haze, he stumbled through memories, hearing his own voice echoing, "What use is a wife who cannot conceive?" Now, every word returned as a curse. He began to watch her in silence, guilt shadowing every glance. He noticed the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, the way she greeted neighbors with grace even when they whispered, the way she prayed at night not with bitterness, but with broken surrender. For the first time, he realized how unworthy he had been of her love. In the privacy of their bedroom, Chukwu tried to speak. One night, he reached for her hand, his voice trembling. "Neoma, I wronged you. Forgive me." His words cracked like brittle glass, but they carried the desperation of a drowning man. She looked at him then, her face unreadable, her silence heavier than anger. Slowly, she withdrew her hand from his grip and turned away, lying quietly without a single word. That silence cut deeper than any insult ever could, because it told him the truth. Forgiveness was not something to be demanded. It was something he had shattered beyond repair. In the days that followed, he tried again, following her into the kitchen, the veranda, the prayer room, stumbling over apologies that never found ground. But Neoma's strength was now different. It was not the strength of a pleading wife, but the strength of a woman who had carried enough pain and was no longer willing to bear more. She did not curse him, did not lash out. Instead, she wore her silence like armor. And in that silence, Chukwu began to see his reflection. A man who had chosen pride over love, lies over truth, and now regret over peace. The morning Neoma decided to leave was calm, almost deceptively so. The birds sang their usual songs, the sun filtered through the curtains, and the world seemed unchanged. But within her, a final decision had crystallized. She rose before dawn, packed her clothes into 2 small bags, and neatly folded away the wedding photograph she once treasured. She dressed simply, tying her headscarf with steady hands, her heart beating not with fear, but with quiet resolve. She had endured years of humiliation, but now she was walking away, not in defeat, but in dignity. When Chukwu saw her with the bags, panic overtook him. He rushed forward, blocking the door, his voice cracking with desperation. "Neoma, please don't leave me. I know I wronged you, but we can start over. Give me another chance." His eyes brimmed with tears, his voice a shadow of the arrogance it once carried. But she only looked at him calmly, her face serene. "I carried more than this marriage deserved," she said softly. "I begged, I prayed, I endured, but you chose lies over love. There is nothing left to carry." With that, she stepped around him, her footsteps light, as though the burden of years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Her exit was not dramatic, no shouting, no accusations, no chaos. It was the quiet leaving of a woman who had already left in her spirit long before her body followed. Neighbors watched from behind their windows as she walked away, some in awe of her composure, others in shame for the roles they had played in her humiliation. And as she disappeared down the street, Chukwu felt the walls of his home closing in, the silence swallowing him whole. He realized too late that dignity, once lost, could never be reclaimed, and that the woman he had treated like nothing had left him with nothing. The house that once buzzed with laughter, prayers, and shared dreams now stood hollow, haunted by echoes of what once was. Yudachukwu wandered aimlessly from room to room, his eyes landing on empty chairs, untouched meals, and the imprint of Neoma's presence in every corner. The bed was colder, the living room darker, the compound eerily silent. He realized how much life she had carried into the home, not just as a wife, but as the heartbeat of the family. Without her, the house was nothing more than walls and furniture. Even the servants walked quietly, their eyes avoiding his, as if they too condemned him in silence. Nights were the hardest. He would sit in the parlor with a bottle of whiskey, staring at the door, half hoping she would return, half knowing she never would. He replayed every moment, the way she used to bring him food, the way her laughter filled the air, the way she prayed for him even as he mocked her. The contrast between the past and the present was unbearable. Regret became his companion, gnawing at him, whispering in his ears that he had destroyed his own joy. He tried to drown it with drink, but regret floated, always rising back to the surface, refusing to be silenced. Even Ifeanyi's absence deepened the void. She had vanished as soon as the truth was revealed, leaving behind nothing but bitterness and embarrassment. Mama Udo, too, had retreated into shame, spending her days indoors, unable to face the community she once boasted before. His sisters had gone silent, no longer daring to insult Neoma now that the truth had revealed their own folly. Yudachukwu was left alone, the echoes of his arrogance surrounding him like ghosts. And in that emptiness, he began to understand that wealth, pride, and reputation meant nothing without the love and respect of the one person he had cast aside. If silence consumed his home, gossip consumed the community. Markets buzzed with the story of Yudachukwu, the man who had called his wife barren only to discover the fault was his own. Women whispered as they sold vegetables. Men shook their heads as they gathered at drinking spots. His name, once synonymous with wealth and ambition, had become a proverb for folly. "Do not mock your wife, lest truth shame you like Yudachukwu," they said. The humiliation spread wider than he could have imagined, reaching even those who lived in distant villages. His downfall was not just personal. It was public, etched into the collective memory of his people. Mama Udo, who had been so vocal, now hid in silence. She avoided the market, sending others to buy her goods. Her friends no longer visited, their laughter replaced by awkward glances. She blamed herself in private, weeping at night for the role she had played in fueling her son's arrogance. But shame was not enough to undo the damage, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Yudachukwu's sisters, who once ridiculed Neoma, now became targets of gossip themselves. Their cruelty had been exposed, and the same mouths that once mocked Neoma now mocked them for their blindness. The family name that had once stood tall was now dragged in the mud. And through it all, Neoma walked freely. She was no longer bound by shame, but was admired for her grace under fire. Women whispered her story with respect, telling their daughters, "Be like Neoma. Carry yourself with dignity even when the world turns against you." The tables had turned, and the woman once mocked as barren had become a symbol of strength. The gossip that destroyed Yudachukwu's pride elevated her honor. And as he sat in the ruins of his pride, he knew there was no redemption the community would grant him. His punishment was not just regret. It was the unending chorus of whispers that would follow him to his grave. Months after leaving Yudachukwu's house, Neoma had rebuilt the fragments of her life quietly. She stayed with her cousin in a modest but warm home in another part of Enugu, immersing herself in church activities and small business ventures. It was there, at a church outreach program to feed widows and orphans, that she met Chimamanda, a gentle widower with a calm voice and eyes that carried both sorrow and kindness. He had lost his wife 3 years earlier and was raising a little girl, Amarachi, on his own. When Neoma bent down to hand food to the child, their eyes met. Amarachi's small hand lingered in hers, as if she sensed the warmth of a mother she had long missed. Chimamanda watched quietly, struck by how naturally his daughter gravitated toward this stranger. Their paths continued to cross after that day. In church, Amarachi would run to sit beside Neoma, and soon the congregation began to notice the bond between them. At first, Neoma resisted the idea of opening her heart again. Her scars were fresh, her wounds deep, and she feared another betrayal. But Chimamanda was patient. He never pushed, never demanded. Instead, he offered friendship, listening ears, and a steady presence. He admired the way she carried herself with dignity despite her past. To him, she was not a woman defined by childlessness, but by resilience. Slowly, his kindness began to water the barren soil of her heart, coaxing life where only pain had once lived. For the first time in years, Neoma felt the stirrings of laughter rise from within her chest. Not the hollow laughter she once forced to hide her sorrow, but genuine joy. Amarachi would tug at her wrapper and ask if she could visit more often. Chimamanda would smile, his eyes softening whenever he saw them together. A seed of healing had been planted, and though Neoma did not yet name it love, she knew something precious was being restored in her heart, something Udachukwa's betrayal had tried, but failed to destroy. Time has a way of softening jagged edges, and in the gentle company of Chimamanda and Amarachi, Neoma began to bloom again. She found herself laughing during family outings, smiling as Amarachi braided her hair with clumsy little fingers, and praying not only for herself, but for this new household she was becoming part of. Chimamanda, too, found his heart healing in her presence. He had once resigned himself to loneliness, but with Neoma, he rediscovered companionship that was tender, thoughtful, and anchored in mutual respect. Unlike Udachukwu, Chimamanda never measured her worth by the children she could bear. One evening, as they walked under the orange glow of streetlights, he told her softly, "You are enough as you are, Neoma. Amarachi doesn't need another mother to give her siblings. She needs someone who will love her unconditionally. And I need someone whose presence feels like peace." Those words sank deep into her soul, unraveling the knots of shame she had carried for years. For once, she was seen not as barren, not as broken, but as whole. As months passed, their bond deepened into love, and eventually, Chimamanda asked for her hand in marriage. Neoma hesitated, her past hovering like a shadow. But when Amarachi slipped her small hand into hers and whispered, "Please say yes, Auntie Neoma," tears blurred her vision. She realized this was God's way of giving her a second chance, a home where love was not conditional, a family built not on pride but on grace. And so, with a heart trembling not in fear but in gratitude, she said yes. The wedding was simple but deeply moving. Unlike the grandeur of her first marriage, this union was small, intimate, filled with genuine joy rather than pomp. Friends and family gathered not to flaunt wealth, but to celebrate love that had been tested by fire and refined into gold. Amarachi twirled in her little white dress, beaming with pride as she declared to everyone, "She's my new mummy." The guests laughed warmly, some wiping away tears at the sight of a broken woman being restored. Neoma, radiant in a modest lace gown, held Chimamanda's hand as they exchanged vows that were not about perfection but about partnership. Together, they built a home that echoed with warmth. Though Neoma never conceived, they chose to adopt twins from an orphanage, a boy and a girl, whose laughter soon filled every corner of their house. For the first time in her life, Neoma's home was alive with the sounds she had once prayed for: footsteps running down the corridor, giggles behind doors, the chorus of little voices calling her mama. She poured herself into motherhood with a passion that erased the scars of her past, and Chimamanda stood beside her every step, affirming her worth, cherishing her presence. In her new life, Neoma discovered that family was not defined by biology, but by love. She understood now that her value had never been tied to her ability to conceive, but to her capacity to nurture, forgive, and rise. Every smile from Amarachi, every hug from the twins, every prayer whispered with Chimamanda was proof that God's justice was not always loud. It was sometimes quiet, gentle, and sweeter than revenge. Back in his empty house, Chukwu withered under the weight of regret. His business had begun to falter, his friends had abandoned him, and the walls of his once proud mansion echoed with silence. He would sit alone in the parlor, staring at the chair where Neoma once prayed, the kitchen where her laughter once floated, the bedroom where her quiet tears had stained the sheets. Pride had stolen everything from him, and now he was left with nothing but memories and shame. He heard whispers of her new life, how she had remarried, how she was raising children, how she carried herself like a queen, and each whisper was a dagger to his soul. He longed to see her, if only once more, to beg forgiveness not for reconciliation, but for peace. Yet he lacked the courage to face her eyes that would reflect back to him the truth he had tried so hard to bury. Neighbors, once his admirers, now mocked him behind his back, saying, "The man who mocked his wife is now mocked by life itself." His mother, broken by shame, avoided him, her once proud shoulders bent under the burden of regret. The world had turned its back on him, just as he had once turned his back on the woman who loved him most. Neoma, however, never spoke a bitter word against him. In her heart, she had released him, not out of love, but out of necessity. Forgiveness was the key that freed her from chains he had bound her with. She lived her life fully, gracefully, knowing that regret was punishment enough for him. And so, as Chukwu faded into obscurity, Neoma thrived in the quiet joy of a second chance, her story etched forever as a testimony that truth, though delayed, always arrives, and when it does, it leaves everyone speechless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching to the end. Don't forget to come back for the next amazing tale yet.